My name is Nicholas Danforth, and this is the War on the Rocks podcast on strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. We're here today with Joshua Geltzer, Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy Homeland Security Advisor. We're here with him to hear his thoughts on the administration's push to renew Section 702 of FISA. Joshua, you wrote an article recently titled, "Reauthorizing Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act is a National Security Imperative." So tell us, why is this a national security imperative?
Nick, thank you so much for the chance to have this conversation. And this collection authority absolutely is a national security imperative. There are non-U.S. persons abroad who do what a lot of us do. They use the communications technologies, think about email providers, that are based in the United States for many reasons. Because they're cheap, they're reliable, they're user-friendly. But some who use those are bad actors. They are terrorists, they are proliferators, they are hostile actors trying to recruit spies in our midst. And we as a government need insight to do our job of protecting the American people into those who are essentially using those technologies against us to harm Americans. That's what Section 702 allows. It is a court-overseen structure for the U.S. government obtaining communications of non-U.S. persons located abroad by working with U.S. service providers and ensuring that this legal provision doesn't expire in December, as it will, absent congressional action. If it were to expire, it would blind us to the things Americans care about most: Russia, China, fentanyl, terrorism. And that's why ensuring its reauthorization is, in the view of us who work on these issues in government, a national security imperative.
No, I think when these debates have taken place in the past, it's usually been focused on terrorism. It was the post 9/11 era. That was where both the government and American citizens' concerns were largely placed. Now, as this reauthorization debate is taking place, it's at a moment where, as we read about at length every day in our own pages, we're transitioning to an era of great power competition. How has the value of these collection authorities, the focus, the benefits the government's derived from them shifted in that light?
The value of 702 collection has really broadened over time as more and more bad actors have essentially caught up to where terrorists were. In other words, it was, in a sense, terrorists who, writ large, first started trying to use our own technologies against us. They were the ones who started using these very reliable, very user-friendly, very cheap or often free services offered by U.S. companies to try to communicate with each other, to recruit additional attackers, to enlist financial support, and so on. But other bad actors have caught up to that. And so you have those who actually work for hostile foreign governments. You have foreign cartels of the type that receive precursor chemicals from China often and then turn those into fentanyl pills or powder that then gets pushed across our border. You have other actors catching up to that, and it therefore, in a sense, has increased and broadened the value of our ability to obtain those communications as those actors have multiplied.
And why then would, again, we're talking about hostile powers rather than terrorist groups. I mean, how is it that actors working on behalf of governments like China, like Russia, have to use American-based software communications?
It is a great question, and it's somewhat surprising at first. You're right to dwell on it. But without going into very granular details, think about the fact that there are multiple ways in which people connect to hostile foreign governments. Some people actually work for them, and even those people use a variety of things to communicate. We all do in just the course of daily life at this point. Then you have those who are maybe one step further removed. Maybe they're not an employee of a foreign government, but they're a source, an asset, a proxy, and they don't have access often to government-provided communications platforms. And if they are communicating with those governments themselves, think about what sort of things they are talking about and think about why that might be of value to us as we try to do our job protecting the American people and having insight into those sorts of hostile actors.
Something in a lot of the coverage about this that comes up, obviously, given secrecy concerns, it's hard to go into a great deal of detail about how this has benefited the United States government and our national security. But to the extent you can talk in specifics about why this has proven valuable, what can you tell us?
It's really important. And we have worked really hard with our intelligence community without risking all the benefits of this collection to be able to say more this reauthorization cycle, because people have a right to know and Congress has a right to know, though they get even more, of course, in classified settings. So let me offer some very specific examples. Locating and ultimately taking off the battlefield last summer, Ayman al-Zawahiri, the global head of al-Qaeda, probably the world's most wanted terrorist at that point, 702 played a role in that. Helping disrupt the assassination on U.S. soil of a dissident as attempted by a hostile foreign regime, 702 enabled that disruption. Understanding precursor chemicals flowing to the foreign cartels in Mexico that then turn those into fentanyl. Our understanding of that has been provided in part by 702. I'll give you one more example because it is so salient in the world right now, and it should be. Helping to rally the world around Ukraine in resisting Russian further aggression and imposition on sovereignty by being able to show some very specific things, like the forced relocation of children in Ukraine by the Russians, the deliberate targeting of refugees fleeing the violence in Ukraine. That has been enabled by collection under 702. And the consequence of being able to speak with that specificity of those horrors, I think, has been crucial to rallying the world to resist that Russian action.
And since the debate that we're having right now is in Congress, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about what additional background information, what additional information you're able to give congressional oversight committees.
Yeah, and I should say, the oversight for 702 is by design, and Congress deserves credit for its own handiwork, a three-branch affair. So you have lawyers in the executive branch who do extensive oversight of how 702 operates. You have the FISA court, a federal court, involved in it. But you also have four committees, the two intelligence committees and the two judiciary committees, receiving a ton of material that shows what the program is and how it's utilized. Then more broadly, we have worked very hard over the past almost year now to speak to your question, Nick, about the value of it across those committees and across the Hill as a whole. It's worth stepping back here. 60% of the current U.S. House of Representatives has never voted on 702 before, just given the 5-year cycles and the turnover. About a quarter of the U.S. Senate has never voted on it. To us in the executive branch, that creates a responsibility to offer to them, and of course, members who've been through this before, understandings of how we're using 702, what its value is, and to the extent they're willing, and they often are, getting them in parts of our intelligence community, in parts of our law enforcement, so they actually can look up on a screen and see how analysts, agents interact with this information in a way that gets them what they need, but is also protective of privacy, which is important here.
Well, and that's, I was going to say, why we're having this debate. When it comes to eavesdropping on Russians who are engaged in stealing Ukrainian babies, I don't think anyone in the United States has any issue with that being covertly monitored by the United States government. The concern, of course, the substance of the debate is that the communications of American citizens get swept up in this and can then be accessed by American law enforcement agencies without a warrant. Why shouldn't Americans, who I think are by and large used to having the confidence of knowing that the United States government needs a warrant to listen to their private communications, why shouldn't they be worried about this if their communications happen to be with someone overseas?
It's a great question. And I think it's helpful to put this in some context, because in a sense, this problem of what we in government call incidental collecting not on the target of it, but someone with whom that target is communicating, it is not unique to 702. So if you obtain a warrant on the probable cause basis for the communications of X suspected criminal, they're communications. They inherently involve that criminal and other people, and you're going to get that criminal communicating with others. Similarly, under what's called traditional FISA or Title I of FISA, in which you're getting individualized court approval for U.S. persons or others on U.S. soil who are either agents of a foreign power or themselves qualify as foreign powers, you're going to get approval to collect against them, but they're going to be talking with other people. Again, that's just the nature of communications, apart from when you talk to yourself. That is true in 702 as well. We need to meet certain thresholds for collecting against non-U.S. persons located abroad, but sometimes they're going to communicate with U.S. persons. That was understood, indeed anticipated, by the crafters of this. Part of what they cared most about in a post-9/11 world was connecting those dots. When things abroad, bad actors abroad, were trying to recruit to their causes or help with operations those who qualify as U.S. persons. We wanted to get that. We didn't want to miss that. But we also want to be careful about what we do with it. And so U.S. person queries, as they're called, when we search within already lawfully collected information using something like a phone number associated with a U.S. person, we think is totally appropriate. We think it would, in fact, cut against the advice of the 9/11 Commission and the Webster Commission to blind ourselves to that which has already been lawfully collected. We've also worked very hard to limit it. So first of all, it's often the FBI's U.S. person queries that get attention. And FBI only receives less than 4% of FISA 702 collection, only collection where the target of it is associated with a predicated investigation. The thought is that's what they need to do their homeland-oriented mission. And then when they query it, they must be able to write down at this point why they believe it is reasonably likely to return foreign intelligence information.
And when you say write down, does that mean simply, write on a sheet of paper? Do they have to do anything with the information that they've written down?
It's a great question. And this is part of the reforms that we think have been really significant. So it used to be that the FBI's databases were set up so that unless you opted out of searching 702 information, you searched it. And this led to compliance errors, which are unacceptable and bad, but in which 702 information was being searched, queried sometimes without that. They have reconfigured their systems. How an agent or an analyst at FBI interacts with 702 information has been fundamentally overhauled. So now, not only are you warned of these standards before having to click into this database, but then something opens up, pop-up almost, think about it on a browser, in which the agent or analyst must write down why they think this 702 U.S. person query is reasonably likely to return foreign intelligence information. And that can later then be fed into the oversight process so that others can review it and assess whether, in fact, that was an adequate justification.
And who are those others? How often is that review happening?
So the Justice Department does review those, doesn't review every single one of those. So that's often the nature of oversight, is that you review some to try to understand compliance overall. But the National Security Division at the U.S. Department of Justice, this is a part of how they interact with, engage with the 702 collection and act as a critical piece of, but again, not all of the oversight regime established for it.
Now, in the letter that your administration sent to Congress in making the case for this, one of the lines that stood out to me was that, as demonstrated in numerous declassified court opinions and other materials, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Corps exercises rigorous independent oversight of activities conducted pursuant to Section 702 to ensure that incidents of noncompliance are addressed through appropriate remedial action. Can you provide any light on what those incidents have been, what noncompliance looks like, and what the appropriate remedial actions have been?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I'll start by just saying what we all feel, which is noncompliance or compliance errors is not okay. It's not acceptable. This is a complicated regime. It serves a lot of value, and we have worked hard to reduce noncompliance, improve compliance, because fundamentally that's not acceptable. Now, often compliance errors, and I'll go right to the ones that matter most to people, which is when U.S. person queries conducted by FBI have not, in fact, been deemed to meet the standards you and I were just talking about, Nick. That is often caught by those Justice Department lawyers as they review them and then presented to that court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, or FISC. And they factor that in when they consider on an annual basis whether to reauthorize 702 as we currently use it as an executive branch at all. And they've consistently said, and as have federal judges outside of the FISC, that 702 is a lawful program, constitutional and statutory, and indeed that U.S. person queries are consistent with the Fourth Amendment and overall lawful. But they also make clear that compliance errors are part of what they consider. And so that is why we are proud that the 2021 reforms that were introduced for FBI U.S. person queries dropped by 93% the number of U.S. person queries conducted by FBI overall, and actually improved the compliance rate within those that are conducted. That's not enough. We then introduced additional reforms in 2023. And as we think about what we can do this legislative cycle, not only to reauthorize this essential authority, but actually improve it, we think entrenching those in law would be a step forward.
So those 93% that were dropped, what was going on there?
So we think a number of them would have been ones that were inadvertently conducted. In other words, when you restructure a system to force an opt-in rather than opt-out, it fundamentally changes both the compliance rate and the overall number. We also think, and again, I've sat over in the Hoover building. I wanted to. I've sat there multiple times and seen how this actually works. The clarity about what the standards are that now is you have to read it and click through it to engage with this information if you're an FBI agent or analyst. We think that has also contributed to backing away from queries that might otherwise have been conducted.
Now, based on the argument that's taking place in Congress right now, one of the questions people have is why not simply require law enforcement agencies to get a warrant before doing U.S. person queries?
So it is the heart of the debate right now, and so I appreciate your asking it. I'll come at it from a few different angles. First of all, we just don't think it's appropriate. It's a mismatch between whatever problems have been identified and solution set. A warrant operates at the stage of obtaining new information. So even the term I tend to quibble with. But let's go to the idea of a court order of some sort. We think it is the wrong direction to go in as a country, as a government, to have to go to a court for permission before looking at already lawfully collected information. This is what the 9/11 Commission urged against. This is what the Webster Commission after Fort Hood urged against. All of their urgings were to better utilize that which has already been collected by the U.S. government lawfully so that we weren't missing putting dots together. There's also couple other problems. It's not clear what standard would even be the standard for that because there may not be evidence of a crime, that's the traditional kind of criminal warrant standard, when we are trying to search for information associated with a potential victim, let's say a hacking victim, a ransomware victim. One more thing I'll put on the table, Nick, and we can dig into all of this, is speed. When the U.S. government, through the Department of Justice, puts things before the FISA court, those are drafted by lawyers, they're reviewed by other lawyers. As with all practice before a federal court, those take time to get right, that they're scrutinized by law clerks, then read by judges, and eventually adjudicated. In that amount of time, we often will lose the ability to do that which the American people want us to do with this, which is warn a company it's about to be hacked or stop someone from being assassinated.
What amounts of time are we talking here?
I mean, this is a regime that doesn't exist, but the idea that one could draft that sort of paperwork, review it, submit it, have it reviewed by clerks and judges in anything short of weeks or months is just inconsistent with how federal court practice operates today.
Now, when you say this is lawfully collected information, of course, part of the legal regime, as I understand it, that enabled that information to be lawfully collected was predicated on the idea that it would be siloed from domestic law enforcement.
I guess I would resist the word siloed a bit. In other words, we have a system in this country in which we don't separate out in institutional structures law enforcement and intelligence. That was the great post-9/11 debate. Should there be an MI5 either in addition to FBI or as a piece of FBI? And we have FBI. That's what we have in this country. They are a part of the intelligence community, and they are law enforcement, premier federal domestic law enforcement. So institutionally, we have not separated those, I think for some very valid and defensible reasons. And again, not in the absence of debate, but in fact, flowing from a lot of consideration and debate about this post-9/11. So then the question becomes what an entity like that has dual charges, but a fundamental charge to protect the homeland does with information of this nature. And as I say, federal courts, including outside the FISC, that have had specifically the U.S. person query issue brought to them, across circuit courts have said that is constitutional, that is consistent with the statutory framework.
Taking a step back from the debate over the substance of this, tell us a little bit about the stage of the administration's dealings with Congress about actually getting this reauthorized.
Yeah, and I think where I'd start, first of all, is with gratitude. This is something that takes time. It's complicated, as here in my conversation, Nick reveals. And as I mentioned before, it is new to many on the Hill. And I'll say we as an executive branch have been really appreciative for the members and their staff who have spent time in parts of the IC, in parts of law enforcement, or just in rooms with us talking through how this program operates, what its value is, and what reforms might strengthen this going forward. What we haven't seen yet on the Hill is actual legislative text. That's a big stage, but it hasn't happened yet. But that is not for a lack of activity and conversation behind the scenes, and to some extent in public. There was a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing with witnesses from across the executive branch a number of weeks ago. And we are eager for those conversations in whatever setting the Hill wants to accelerate as we get towards the sunset date. The other point I would just make here, and it came out at that Judiciary Committee hearing a number of weeks ago, was one particularly concrete and we think particularly promising idea of how to retain the value of this program and actually improve the fundamental legal architecture, which is to take the sort of reforms we've put in place, such as how you have to provide justification before doing a U.S. person query, how certain U.S. person queries require higher level review within FBI, a number of reforms, and actually entrench those in law so that neither we as an administration, but probably more importantly, any subsequent administration, that they can't roll that back, at least without congressional agreement.
And I think this is the elephant in the room that's difficult to, well, let's talk about it. I mean, this is taking place at a moment of unprecedented domestic polarization. Everyone participating in this debate is participating it with, I think it's fair to say, a newfound skepticism of how a administration they didn't necessarily agree with would use the kinds of authorities that are being debated now. Can you comment on how that's affected the discussion?
I think you're right that as a descriptive fact, you and I are sitting in an often polarized Washington. And I'll say one step further that the idea of thinking ahead as to how certain authorities could be misused, I think that's healthy. I think that's something that's good for the U.S. Congress to do. It's good for us as an executive branch to do. That is where we think entrenching some of the guardrails we've put in place as a matter of law would be progress. And then I guess what I'd say is we have tried to keep this issue as apolitical as we can. This is a statutory framework that has been supported by House and Senate in various incarnations, 2008, and then a couple of subsequent reauthorizations across parties. It has been signed into law at this point by presidents of both parties. And we think the work that one does under it, countering proliferation, countering fentanyl, countering terrorism, addressing threats posed by Russia and China, that there are huge bipartisan consensus about the fundamentals of that. And so our hope is to find a space where we do, as we think we must, get this reauthorized and indeed see it reauthorized with some reforms that make it strong.
Thanks so much for sitting down to talk about this with us.
Thank you, Nick. Appreciate it.